Hey there. We wanted to let you know that we'll be having conversations about trauma and that there's also some explicit language in this podcast. So please take care of yourself while listening. Hey everyone, I'm Jamilah King, and this is HBO's Last Call podcast, the official companion podcast from Max and Pineapple Street Studios. Last Call, When a Serial Killer Stalked Queer New York, is produced by Story Syndicate. The 4-part documentary series tells the story of how in the early 90s, at a time when homophobia, hate crimes, and the AIDS crisis were on the rise, a serial killer preyed on New York City's gay men. Most true crime stories focus on how victims died. This is a series about the lives they lived. If you haven't watched the first 3 episodes of the series, check them out before listening to today's show. This is episode 3, Michael. In these first 3 episodes, we hear the stories of Thomas Mulcahy, Peter Anderson, Tony Marrero, and Michael Sequeira, 4 gay men whose murders are starting to get attention in and around New York City. But that attention, especially the news coverage, varies widely.
To the mainstream media, Sequeira was still a gay man that hung out at gay bars.
The media never gave the description of Michael that he deserved. It was more another gay man bites the dust.
When the serial murders were finally covered, the mainstream media, they wrote about it in a kind of a salacious way.
In this episode of the Last Call podcast, we'll talk about something near and dear to my heart, journalism. How were the murders portrayed in the media? What did it look like when that reporting came from inside the community? And how has that legacy influenced what LGBTQ reporting looks like today? One important source of news and information from the time of the murders featured throughout the series is Gay USA, a weekly hour-long TV news program. Created in the 1980s, Gay USA set out to put a spotlight on issues that other outlets weren't covering, like bringing attention to AIDS during the early days of the crisis and sending reporters to political conventions to ask candidates about issues facing the queer community. The team behind Gay USA has spent decades doing the work. To unpack the history of the program and to dissect the past, present, and future of queer journalism, I've got one very special guest, someone featured throughout the series that we're going to get up close and personal with. Joining me in the studio is one of the co-hosts of Gay USA, Andy Humm. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being here. I'm so excited to dive deep into Gay USA in a moment. But first, Andy, because this is an episode all about journalism, I wanted to talk about your history and the path that led you to the field. Do you remember the first time you saw a queer paper or magazine or outlet?
Yes. When I was a little kid in Baldwin, Long Island, before Stonewall, the Advocate had started to publish, and there it was at the candy store or, down the block where I got my ice cream or whatever. And I would stare at that thing on the rack, and I had to have it and read it, but it was just even purchasing it was sort of an act of, because, Julius behind the counter has known me since I was like 5, but I did it anyway, and I bought it, and that's how I got started.
I have a sneaking suspicion this won't be the last act of defiance we hear about from you. Okay, so how do you end up going from this teen on Long Island reading about queer life to someone who's writing about it?
Here's what happened with me in journalism. I basically saw myself as a gay activist. And when I came back to New York and lived in New York. And one of the forms of activism is doing LGBTQ journalism. So what were there in those days? There was a paper called the New York City News, your gay and lesbian weekly newspaper in New York. So I wrote for them all the time, but I was also an activist at the same time, and was writing about things that we were doing in some of our organizations, trying to pass a gay rights bill and all those kinds of things. And the first stories I wrote for New York City News were mostly about trying to get the damn gay rights bill passed.
And the gay rights bill, that was a bill in New York City intended to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, right?
Yeah, New York was the first city to have the idea of a gay rights bill and put sexual orientation into the human rights law. And it almost passed in 1974, but the Archdiocese of New York, the Catholics, and the firefighters got involved and they stopped it. And then it took until 1986 to pass that bill. So it took a lot of pushing, and at least we were able to cover it. Because you're talking about a time when the New York Times wouldn't even use the word gay. They wouldn't use the word. I mean, and to get coverage, of course, their lack of coverage on AIDS accelerated the crisis tremendously by the fact that they wouldn't cover it. And everybody was closeted at the Times. The editor was Abe Rosenthal. He was a homophobe. If he found out you were gay, he was going to fire you.
So for you, when you were just starting your career, did it ever feel like a professional risk to be out in the workplace? Especially in the 70s and 80s, was there ever a worry about how it could affect your career prospects?
I always felt an obligation. I felt guilty if I didn't come out in a situation. Look, I was a copy boy at NBC when I was a kid in radio, and I was out gay then. This is 1977. And I remember one day, there was a fire at the Everard Baths. 9 people died. This is right before AIDS. It would be a big thing if AIDS hadn't happened. We would remember it more. Nobody remembers it now. And one of the top guys, the anchors, he just turns to his friend in the newsroom. He goes, "Oh, that'll be an easy fire to get out of. Just tie 7 faggots together and climb down." And I bit his head off. I didn't care if I lost my job. I just bit his head off. Again, I was a page. I wasn't really contemplating a big career at NBC, so I felt free to talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think for most people, to be a page telling a reporter what to do, I think a lot of people in your shoes might not feel empowered to speak up like that. But it sounds like you knew from the get-go that a mainstream outlet wasn't for you. And I'm wondering, in those early days, as you were advocating for the queer community and reporting on it, did you have any guidance on how to do that? I mean, for example, we readily have style guides now about the right language to use around things like sexuality and gender. But back then, was there anything like that? Or anyone that you could turn to for advice?
Yes, lesbians. And I mean that because, when I joined the movement in New York, I mean, I'd been president of the Gay Student Union at the University of Virginia. And when I came to New York, I joined the activist groups. I joined the Gay Activist Alliance. And in 1977, we formed a Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights. Then we had men and women working together. And those women schooled me. I was in my early 20s. They taught me not to use certain terms and to, clean up my language and raise my consciousness.
Was this grammar? Like, what kind of terms were they?
Well, like, for instance, even something like using the word girl. I can picture this woman who just, very, very slowly explained to me it was important not to talk about women as girls. And I learned, and she taught me that.
Okay, so first you were a page at NBC and then writing about the queer community for New York City News. So how did Gay USA come about?
Gay USA grew out of the gay cable network that this guy, Lou Maletta, had started.
And who is Lou Maletta?
Lou Maletta was a pornographer. That's what he did. I mean, and he ran a sex club. So this is what he did. So he had all this equipment, and his first show was an erotic show, and it was quite controversial because he got it on cable, and of course it attracted headlines because people said, "You can't put this on television," and he said, "Oh yes, I can," and he was very out there in doing that. And he said, "I have all this video equipment, and I'm going to do all kinds of things for the community. I'm going to, bring entertainment figures on, and I'm going to cover the news." So he did a show called Pride and Progress, and then it eventually evolved into Gay USA. And so he would put an ad in Variety and said, "You want to be on a gay television show and watch and help us deliver the news?" And so we would hand scripts to all these actors who would then do the stories. Some of them weren't even gay. They just wanted to be on TV. It was a big deal in those days.
So Gay USA first had these actors reading the news, but then eventually you filled that role as a co-host. Though unlike the actors, you were actually gay. So how did you get involved with Gay USA?
I got involved because I had a friend who was doing stuff there, and he said, why don't you come in and do a commentary, once a week? And, oh, okay. So I did. I did one commentary about what we needed to do about the issues of the day. And that's all I did for several months. And then he started this Pride and Progress show. And so it's been ever since. And I really haven't missed a week since 1985.
So how would people watch the gay cable network? Was it only available in New York City?
Well, so Gay Cable Network started just as a public leased access show, in Manhattan. And so the producer, Lou Maletta, bought the time, and we could do what we want on that show. And he started mailing videotapes around the country.
Physically making the tapes.
Correct.
Putting them in the mail.
Yes.
Truly the definition of grassroots. And were you mailing it to other public access stations around the country?
Yes, and they would sometimes do their own surround material, like in Cincinnati and other places. They had their own shows. So there's a rich library out there of LGBTQ issues being covered on television around the country. I mean, I'd have people come up to me and say, oh, I used to watch you in Atlanta, and you helped me come out of the closet, that kind of stuff. So that's how it got around. FedExing or mailing videotapes around the country. It really was a network.
What was your budget?
Budget? I didn't get paid for 30 years. I mean, I did it as a volunteer. I had other jobs.
So not a very big budget, it sounds like.
The budgets are very minimal. And Lou Maletta was doing a leased access show, so he could run commercials. And he ran, some of them, he got some mainstream sponsors like Naya Water, was, for whatever reason, advertised, trying to reach the gay market, the Bud Light of its day. And there was some money coming in from some groups that did spots on it, like GMHC. And we finally got a grant about 6 years ago from the Ford Foundation for a couple of years and paid stipends to myself, and still didn't take any money.
It's incredible that for 30 years you did this as a volunteer.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. When I was a kid, if you got asked to speak somewhere about LGBTQ stuff, you did it. It was like, wow, they're going to let us talk. I get invited to schools. Even in the early days of the Gay Activists Alliance, they had a speakers bureau that went all over the country. But, they would go into the schools in the early 70s, so they didn't get paid for it. And now there are groups that actually do get paid to do stuff like that. But it was always felt as an activist, if you were allowed to speak out about something, it was a great privilege.
Was there something about broadcast versus print that you saw as having the ability to make a bigger kind of impact?
Definitely. I write stories sometimes, and nobody reads the byline, and they, oh, you wrote that or whatever, in terms of an impact. But it's a print story, and it's limited in how it gets passed around. And this was a lot before the internet and things. So television, you can feel the immediate impact. You walk the streets and people say, oh, we saw you on TV. I have guests that I bring on to the show who, deserve a lot of attention, but until they are on television, they don't have the same impact. So yes, it does.
Well, speaking of the power of television and visual media, I think we should get into this week's episode of Last Call. And just to give a quick recap for our listeners here, in episode 3, we hear the story of Michael Sequeira, whose death prompts the creation of a multi-jurisdictional task force, with police departments from different states on the East Coast banding together to investigate the murders, with one notable exception. The NYPD isn't a part of it. And we hear about this seeming indifference the NYPD has to investigating the case. For example, we see AVP was offering a $10,000 reward for information about the murders, but the NYPD wasn't at the time, and how they only assigned 4 officers to the case. So I guess just to start, what was it like watching this episode, and what memories did it bring up for you?
I have to say, I turned it on at 11 p.m. one night, and I watched one episode, and of course it flips right over to the next one, and I didn't get to bed till 3 o'clock in the morning because it's this bracing expose on what we were up against, getting the police to do something, getting the criminal justice system to do anything, the DAs, all those people. And I have to say, watching Last Call, I don't remember doing this, but when the AVP and all these groups finally pressured Mayor Dinkins. I go to Gracie Mansion. They're announcing they're finally going to do something to get that killer. And Ray Kelly, who was the police commissioner, is on the stand.
We're encouraging reporting. We acknowledge the fact that crimes have been underreported. We acknowledge the fact that there has been some tension in the past, and hopefully this is going to bridge that gap.
There I am saying, Commissioner Kelly, you're a member of the Emerald Society,
which describe gays as deviants. What does that say about your ability to handle these things sensitively?
How can you be fair in terms of the conduct of this investigation? And then he goes and says,
I'm a professional law enforcement executive, and I've been in the business for 30 years. And the fact that I'm a member of the Emerald Society has no effect on my ability to govern the agency.
I'm not going to leave the Emerald Society. Oh, no, you're not. And, I don't remember doing that, but I'm glad I did.
And in the same episode, the concerns you called Police Commissioner Kelly out on to his face, we also hear you discussing them on Gay USA with activist Bill Dobbs. And Bill elaborates on this same concern.
We have an anti-gay police commissioner. Police Commissioner Kelly has a long track record of being completely insensitive to gay and lesbian issues that makes people feel like maybe they're not safe and maybe a murderer isn't going to get caught. Where does that leave you?
Bill Dobbs, somebody I talk to almost every day still. And Bill, is a big advocate of fairness in the criminal justice system. So this is one of these cases where he's saying, we're not even getting our stuff investigated. But that was always true, having to pressure the cops. Look, we always had to press the police to do things. And when they did things, they often did things really badly. It took a lot of pressure to get things done. And it's still true today. Look how hard it was to get the police to intervene in these series of drug murders of gay men coming out of bars.
And I'll just jump in with some context here for anyone that didn't follow the story. The case you're talking about is this series of murders that happened in New York over the past year where gay men were slipped drugs at bars and then subsequently robbed and killed.
But the police just classified them as drug overdoses. And their parents or their friends knew he doesn't take drugs. He got drugged. He was murdered. And it took months, actually more than a year in some cases, to get the police to look into that while other people were getting drugged and murdered. And not just gay people. This MO was used against non-gay people coming out of straight clubs. So, yeah, it's very, very hard.
So, as we've been talking about, the police are one big part of this episode. And another area of examination here is the mainstream media and the ways in which they were reductive about how they describe the murders. In this episode, Matt Foreman and B. Hansen from AVP point out all the ways that the coverage of the Last Call killer leans into these ugly, reductive stereotypes that the media would rely on to write about gay life, down to the name, Last Call Killer.
Mike McAlery, who was at the Daily News, he's the one that called it the Last Call Killer.
I do remember when he came up with that name, Last Call Killer, and I thought it was offensive and anti-gay, frankly. It's talking about, okay, you've been drinking, you're desperate to take somebody home, and look what happens.
What do you remember about the coverage you were reading in mainstream publications at the time?
Last Call Killer was coined by Mike McAlery, who was a real creep because he was quite the homophobe. Not just on this, there was a lesbian who was raped, I believe it was in Prospect Park, and he leaked all this police stuff to disparage her and put it in the paper and all these kinds of things. So he was writing sensationalistic stuff, and that was the kind of stuff that he did.
As we're talking about storytellers getting the story right, I'm curious to know, when you got approached about being interviewed for the Last Call documentary series, what made you trust that the filmmakers were approaching the story in the right way?
Yeah, being interviewed by them, I got this sense that they were really going for something a lot deeper than just the facts, ma'am. They really wanted to get into what are the roots of this, what was going on with the police, what do you still feel about the police, what do you know about the police, and all those things. So yeah, the thoroughness with which they looked at those issues made me feel good. And how has it been for you? I mean, you've seen The Last Call. So what did you feel looking back at that era when it was so hard to get covered? Was it any kind of a revelation to you, or just, oh, yeah, that's the way it was?
Andy turning it around on me. I mean, yes and no. Yes, it was a revelation because I wasn't familiar with the story. And especially as a queer New Yorker, it feels really important to know this history. But I think when I was growing up, I was still seeing stories like this, talked about in similar framing as the media was, not honoring the victims, perpetuating fear. And I mean, one example that comes to mind is in 2002, I was in high school and there was the Gwen Araujo case where she was a trans teenager in the Bay Area who was killed. And I remember, being that young, it's hard to really articulate how you feel. Like, I knew that I felt for this girl and her family, and I knew I identified with some part of this story. But I also felt a lot of fear. And a lot of that fear was perpetuated by the fact that, if you are a queer person, a trans person, and you are discovered for who you are, you can be killed, and I think I internalized that so much that it was second nature to me. So I didn't even think about it until I was confronted with a case where it was being talked about explicitly. And then I was like, oh, I'm scared, right? So yeah, that's definitely something that brought me back. But watching the series, I mean, one thing that really stood out to me was just like the incredible work that you and Anne were doing and continue to do. And I'd love to take a few minutes and talk about a few big picture journalism things. One thing I think is so distinct about you and has made you so ahead of your time is your willingness to be both an activist and a journalist, which sometimes, especially at mainstream news outlets, can be discouraged. What's it been like really occupying both those roles simultaneously throughout the years?
I am for LGBTQ rights. I'm for them. So that's clear. But I also cover things within our community. If people are screwing up or being corrupt or anything like that, we cover that too.
Not just giving a pass to a public figure just because they're queer.
We're not cheerleaders, for everybody in the movement, for everything that they do. We have dialogues about, is this the best strategy, or is this person, screwing things up? We're not really trying to get people or anything, but that's part of the story that we cover as well. Now, I have to say, I look at the stories I wrote for the New York City News in the late 70s and early 80s. How could they let me even write that? I mean, I was just basically writing, our own stuff.
Because at the time, being an activist, you were part of that community that you were writing about as a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, but again, I think we always did it fairly. See, that's the goal for me in journalism, is to be fair to everybody, including the opposition. I remember one time they had 300 people on the steps of City Hall speaking against marriage equality. And I was the only reporter who showed up to cover them. There I am standing there with my notebook, and no other reporter showed up, so they did their press conference anyway. I wrote the story. I got feedback. They said, we thought you were very fair.
What do you think about the landscape of LGBTQ media today?
Well, I mean, landscape of LGBTQ media, a lot of it, of course, it's almost all online now. The newspapers aren't doing so great. We have the Gay City News in New York, and I still write for them. Some of the newspapers, like the Chicago paper, have just gone online. There's the Washington Blade. I mean, there's some. But there's plenty of stuff online. The problem is, how do you monetize that and people make the living that they should make from doing this kind of work? And obviously, the more freedom and support you can give to people, especially if they have to do in-depth stories. I mean, I covered the trial of Abel Cedeno, who was convicted of murder. This was a gay kid who was bullied all his life, and he lashed out with a knife.
Yeah, this was in the Bronx.
A couple of years ago. Yeah. I was there every day for that trial. And my editor, they wanted a story every day of the trial, so I gave it to them and covered it.
And to connect this back to where we started, have you, in covering trials with queer people at the center of the cases for decades, have you seen more journalists attend those trials over the years? I think back to those days you told us about when the New York Times wouldn't dedicate resources to covering queer stories. Do you feel like you've seen a bigger journalistic presence at trials like this?
Well, that was a big trial because it was a violent incident in the New York City schools. So they were all over that one. But where the victim is gay or LGBTQ, there's often less concern.
But at least there's always outlets like Gay USA to be concerned. And actually, on that note, before we go, I'd love if you could tell us about the person who helps do all this important coverage with you, your co-host, Ann Northup.
She's terrific, first of all. I mean, she has a long history in journalism. And so working with her all these years, it makes it so much easier to do it with Ann because she's so smart and she's so on top of all the stories. Now, we both would like to retire. I mean, I'm pushing 70, she's in her 70s. So let me make a pitch out there for whoever wants to take this over and probably make it a better television show. I mean, again, it's just the two of us with a rich history of knowledge and things like that. But, it's got a network. It could be made into something more.
You heard it here first, folks. A Last Call podcast exclusive. Listeners, you could be the next host of Gay USA. You could be the one journalist in the trial room no one else is covering, or the one journalist willing to confront the police commissioner, or any of the other great things Andy and Ann have done over the years. Thank you so much for this lesson in queer history, Andy, and thank you so much for coming into the studio today.
Nice to be with you.
HBO's Last Call podcast is a production of HBO, Story Syndicate, and Pineapple Street Studios. I'm your host, Jamilah King. This episode was produced by Ari Saperstein. Our producers are Ari Saperstein, Melissa Slaughter, and Megan Doherty. Our consulting producer is Nikita Shepard. Engineering and mixing by Pedro Alvara. Special thanks to Jade Brooks for additional engineering. Production music is courtesy of HBO. Gabrielle Lewis and Barry Finkel are our executive producers at Pineapple Street. From Story Syndicate, our executive producers are Kate Barry, Mala Chappell, Anthony Corona, and Howard Gertler. Special thanks to Michael Glickstadt and Allison Cohen and Savon Slater on the HBO podcast team. The next episode will be out Sunday. Be sure to tune in right after the latest episode of Last Call airs on Max.